Voters, start your engines. The polls are opening up here in Kansas. But some schools are closing their doors to COVID as the state's numbers keep rising. Plus, a false attack ad, a lawsuit, and 3 politicians back in the hot seat. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.
I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. This first story is a case of everything old is new again. Wichita Mayor Brandon Whipple this week added 3 names to his slander lawsuit over an attack ad in last year's mayoral race. All local politicians: Wichita City Councilman James Clendenin, Kansas State Representative Michael Capps, and Sedgwick County Commissioner Michael O'Donnell. Greg Miller and I broke it all down for you this week on Cake News.
Nearly a year after a false attack ad accused Brandon Whipple of sexual harassment,
why would he say that?
Attorneys for the then candidate and now mayor are naming names.
It's sad. We really had, I think, no choice but to actually follow the evidence.
In new filings, Whipple's attorneys allege a conspiracy between City Councilman James Clendenin, State Representative Michael Capps, and Sedgwick County Commissioner Michael O'Donnell, who wanted him to lose the race. The new documents claim Capps created a shell company and wrote the check for the ad. O'Donnell is called the driving force behind the conspiracy, and Clendenin was called the principal fundraiser to add credibility to the effort. But when the ad was proven false, it claims the 3 Republicans started to panic. Days before the election, they met and discussed trying to blame Republican Party Chair Dalton Glasscock and even County Clerk Kelly Arnold. That same night, O'Donnell allegedly reminded Capps of, quote, what he had learned in politics: avoid the truth at all expense and just go on the attack. Now, Whipple won the mayor's race, obviously. He's now suing as well Matthew Colburn, a video producer who admits shooting an ad that falsely suggested Whipple had been accused in that harassment case at the Kansas State House. Whipple's attorneys are asking for damages higher than $75,000 now. Greg Miller, Cake News investigates.
This is a political hit job.
Michael O'Donnell told me he's mad about being added to the mayor's lawsuit over a political attack ad from last year's mayoral race.
The mayor's a Democrat. He's supporting my Democratic opponent. Nobody questions these things. And now he's suing me the day that advance ballots go out.
He says he hasn't even given his deposition in the suit yet, adding it was scheduled for Thursday but is being rescheduled for the weekend. He said the main witness in the case against him and his new co-defendant, Matthew Colburn, has no credibility.
Last month, he said it was Dalton Glasscock that was the mastermind. This month, now he's saying it's me.
O'Donnell vows to fight back, drafting a countersuit with his lawyers against Whipple and Colburn both. He charges Whipple has had it out for him for months, pointing to this texting conversation between the two of them from April. The transcript O'Donnell gave us of that message shows Whipple cussing him out and threatening not to work with him again over a Facebook post.
He called me, told me he was going to make sure I go down in this next election. And now he's waiting to sue me today, and I have the text message to prove it.
Now, James Clendenin has also released a statement saying, in part, it is clear to me this is a well-manipulated and weaved political lawsuit designed to gain maximum political damage based on what they believe my involvement was. I maintain I had nothing to do with the production, content, or distribution of the video. In his own written statement, Michael Capps said, this amended filing is based entirely on speculation and hearsay. It comes as no surprise from Rathbun and Whipple, now 2 weeks before the general election, when Commissioner O'Donnell is in a highly contested race against a radically left opponent backed financially by Brandon Whipple and his goons. You can read both men's full statements on KSN.com. Joining me today to discuss this and other issues, we have Suzanne Perez, opinion editor of the Wichita Eagle, here by Zoom. And here on the desk with me, Dr. Russell Arbin Fox, political scientist from Friends University. So, Russell, I'm going to start with you. Slander lawsuits from politicians face a much higher legal requirement to even happen. They're pretty rare. Does that lend credence that this is politically motivated?
I think that what you had here was something that was just out of the ordinary for a citywide race. A lot of people have commented that Wichita city politics have become more partisan and more polarized over the last couple of election cycles, but still you haven't seen in Wichita politics an accusation about sexual harassment, especially an accusation that was so obviously false and proven false so early on. I think that Mayor Whipple genuinely felt like his family had been hurt by this ad, and more importantly, he felt like maybe it was appropriate for him to respond in kind. So taking a lawsuit seeking damages for the harm that's contained with this ad. I am kind of surprised that it took an entire year. They waited until just before the deadline that they formally went ahead and they included the other names with the lawsuit. Obviously, those names have been in play. People have been talking about this. The Wichita Eagle and other news organizations have driven investigations of this, but it's only now that we see the specific allegations laid out. It's interesting to see the responses that O'Donnell and Clendenin and Capps are making to this. Obviously, they're painting this as a partisan attack, but if you look closely at their responses, it's interesting the words they choose. Like, for instance, Clendenin talks about, I had nothing to do with the content or distribution of this ad. He doesn't say he had nothing to do with funding this ad, which of course is the primary allegation of the lawsuit. So.
Yeah, very interesting, and I'm interested in the fact that you brought up the history of this lawsuit as it relates to the Eagle. Suzanne, in a lot of ways, it goes back to an investigative piece that the Eagle did on Mayor Longwell during that campaign.
Right. This goes back way back into that mayoral race, and even before that. And our investigative reporters made the connection between Capps' shell company and the funding for that ad. One thing that's incredibly interesting to me now, too, given the political nature of this case, already last month, Michael O'Donnell had argued that if he gives a deposition, he will be giving a deposition in coming days, but what he actually says is not going to be made public until after the election. He actually argued that he shouldn't have to give a deposition until after the election because whatever he says could be used could sway voters. So we just find that really interesting too. Obviously, we think those depositions should be public as soon as they're given. But because if something is said to sway voters, I think they should know it before an election.
And you're talking about swaying voters. Are there voters to be swayed in this race, or is it like many others at this point where people have pretty much made up their mind?
Well, broadly speaking, you should assume that people have made up their minds. I mean, we're 2 weeks away from the election, and as Suzanne pointed out, this particular story, yes, it's local news. It, doesn't compare with arguments about, who we're going to vote for president, for example. But still, there's been pretty exhaustive coverage of this, and I think most people are aware of who is behind this attack ad. They're aware of the lawsuit in regards to it. I do think that you could see some marginal effect within races. So, let's take a look at Michael O'Donnell versus Sarah Lopez. Michael O'Donnell's the incumbent. Michael O'Donnell represents South Wichita and parts of rural Sedgwick County that tend to be pretty conservative, but are also more blue collar. And therefore, you might see a lot of people there who are approaching this question thinking about, well, I'll go with the incumbent, but I don't want to vote for a liar. I don't want to vote for somebody, who's crude in some particular way. Sarah Lopez has obviously tried to capitalize on that by emphasizing the issue of ethics in her race. Probably everybody who's going to be convinced by that has already been convinced, but as you see a deposition actually happening and as you see names being listed in a lawsuit being filed, you might see some marginal effect on some voters who say to themselves, okay, maybe enough is enough here.
Yeah. Well, we've got 3 weeks to find out exactly what sort of impact that will have. Meanwhile, turning to the pandemic, businesses are still struggling to keep going under difficult financial conditions. Many have moved to a form of outdoor service, but with the weather turning, that may not be an option much longer. So what's next? KAKE's Eli Higgins takes a look.
Sarah Leslie is the owner of Leslie Coffee Company in Wichita. In August, she applied for the Open Air ICT program, which allowed her and several other business owners to operate on the sidewalks, making it safer for employees and customers to avoid being exposed to COVID-19.
Outside, we have so those normally sit over here.
But with cold weather just around the corner, she worries about her business dwindling again. And Mayor Brandon Whipple says it creates a whole new list of challenges for businesses and the city.
Our challenge really isn't so much just the open air ICT that we've already done, but also what does that next policy look like? What is the next thing we could be doing to protect customers, to protect ourselves, our neighbors, and make sure that our small businesses still are able to deliver their services safely.
Whipple says the free open air ICT permits will still be available for businesses to take advantage of throughout the winter and encourages owners to continue thinking outside the box. And that's exactly what Leslie plans on doing.
We did order some heaters. They're like propane heaters, so like you could have on a patio. I think one would go over in this area.
As we enter into another season of uncertainties with COVID-19, Leslie says she has one simple hope that would make her life much easier.
I hope we have a very warm winter with little to no snow.
In Wichita, Eli Higgins, Cake News on your side.
And many bars and restaurants over the last few weeks have been arguing for later closing times to allow them to get a few more customers in the door. Just before we started recording the show, Dr. Gerald Minns, the Sedgwick County health officer, signed a new order pushing the closing time back to 1 a.m. And Suzanne, I know at the Eagle, you guys have been tracking these developments.
Right. I mean, the bars and restaurants have been particularly hard hit, obviously, by the COVID crisis. At first with a complete shutdown, only curbside service. Then since then, there have been any number of regulations, on again, off again, mandatory, voluntary. So just today, right before this taping, Gerald Minns passed an order extending the time bars and clubs can stay open until 1 a.m. That order takes effect next Thursday and lasts until December 9th. Now, this is happening as COVID cases are rising in our area, but there has been just an incredible effort on the part of local officials, certainly to lower the effect on those businesses and to give them more of a shot of staying open. Interestingly, we had a story recently that says liquor sales are up. Liquor store sales are up tremendously in Kansas and nationwide during COVID, but the bar sales are way down. So people are still drinking; they're just not going out as much, given the risks.
Sounds like the rest of it. People are still eating; they're just not going out as much lately. But one aspect of this is, are we reaching the point where bars and restaurants are starting to rebel? We've got one in Lawrence that is suing the Douglas County health officer over a similar curfew. Are we reaching the point where we're starting to have rules that people just aren't going to follow anymore?
Well, of course, we've had rules that people were disregarding from the very beginning, and we continue to see that. I think that some of this is political. You've got people who are waiting to see if there's going to be some kind of reset in policy in conjunction with the election. Speaking just here in Kansas, obviously, depending on the makeup of the legislature, you may see some support for Governor Kelly in extending her powers in certain ways, or you might see the legislature trying to push back even further on limiting her powers. And then, of course, you get down to the county and the city level, and you're wondering how people are going to be responding to that. We're not having city elections, but we're having county elections. And depending on how county elections go forward, you might see, decisions being made that are more supportive of what Governor Kelly has pushed forward, or you might see a renewed willingness to challenge that. But even besides the politics, you have to recognize that we're over 6 months into this.
No.
It is wearying for a lot of people, especially with winter coming on. Mm-hmm. People are asking themselves, is it really going to continue like this all the way through the holiday season and all the way into the new year? It's a hard thing for people to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. Suzanne, you had a thought on this?
Well, interestingly too, Michael O'Donnell, a county commissioner, had proposed that $5 million of the CARE Act money go specifically to the bar and nightclub industry to try and help them through this. That was either rejected or didn't get a second. I think it didn't get a second at the board. But so they're trying all kinds of things to try and lower the impact on these particular businesses. But Russell is right; they are hurting, but it's just a delicate balance that the county has to make to try and keep people safe and keep businesses open.
Well, definitely an interesting discussion, but we've got a couple of other things we still need to talk about. For example, with the numbers of COVID cases trending up, this week Kansas reported its first COVID-related death from a school-based cluster. And with more and more rural counties seeing rising rates of the viral infection, some school districts are changing their approach. KAKE's Jake Bowles spoke with the Newton schools about its decision to move to remote classes.
Move to approve the Orange mode of learning beginning October 19th through October 23rd, based upon the data presented today.
Students in Newton will see some changes over the next 2 weeks after the decision at the school board meeting Monday night.
Like I said, I hate making a change like this with no turnaround time, but when you look at the number of cases and the trend, I'd rather stop it as quickly as we can now.
Beginning this Thursday and Friday, middle and high school students will switch to hybrid learning, and starting next Monday, 7th through 12th grade students will switch to only learning from home. It's part of the district's Orange Mode coronavirus response plan.
We are orange for everybody, but orange is a little different for the younger kids.
Pre-K through 6th grade will go to a hybrid model, 2 days in the building, 3 days virtual. Spokesperson Samantha Anderson says the district created a flexible plan for schools instead of a permanent plan for the entire semester.
The way we set it up was so that we could kind of react to how much COVID there is in our community, because we wouldn't want to make a decision at the beginning of the year in September and then have that decision locked in for, a month or months at a time.
Anderson says there are 3 main factors the district keeps in mind in deciding whether to keep students in class.
What does our current absenteeism at this time compare to, over the last few years? And then there's the 2-week county percent positive case rate. And then there's also just the general trend of the cases in the county.
The district decided the coronavirus numbers across Harvey County are too high, so they're starting these new limits Thursday into next week, but it's not permanent. The board will meet again next Monday.
And Suzanne, I know you spent a big portion of your career in journalism covering education, and you've still been keeping a close eye on things, as have I. Is this really, from your perspective, the beginning of a trend?
Well, it's hard to say. So much of the data is hard to get. Things like the absentee rates. There are guidelines that the state has put out as to how school districts are supposed to judge whether or not they're remote or in person. But it really seems like every district is looking at these guidelines differently. They have their own guidelines. They're interpreting red differently from another county's red or orange. We have shown maps of as far as the positive test rate throughout the state is becoming redder and redder in terms of the positive test rate almost every county. Now Wichita schools went full remote for secondary schools early on, and they will be trying to reconsider that going into the second 9 weeks. Do they bring their middle and high schoolers back in some in-person capacity? The education commissioner for the state of Kansas told educators recently that this is not sustainable, that students have to be coming back into school in some way. They're really, really struggling with this. In the meantime, it's not really showing that schools are any kind of super spreader. In fact, when you look at the data for Wichita schools, there are quite a number of, when they pull out positive test cases, there are quite a number of remote students testing positive. So it's not like only the in-person students are testing positive.
Yeah. Well, and we spoke of at the beginning that there has now been 1 death related to a school cluster, but it does not appear to be a student. There are no deaths in the state under the age of 18, and perhaps that plays a role as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Suzanne has to say about the struggle over the data and our difficulty in trying to make decisions about something that, one, we have unclear information about. We're unclear about, contagion effects. We're unclear about education effects. We're unclear about just basic attendance among students. And we're also struggling with the fact that any kind of decision is going to be compared with decisions that are being made in other jurisdictions as well. What little information that I think is really reputable, that is bubbling up over the months of this experiment, is that, as has been said, it's really important to find ways to get students back in classrooms. The educational experience that most of them are having online is not the kind of educational experience they need, particularly for younger people, and especially in large cities where there's high levels of poverty, a lot of kids that maybe don't have ideal home life situations with parental help and whatnot. There is really bubbling up a sincere concern that maybe dramatic things are going to have to be taken, drastic actions may have to be taken to create environments to allow the children to safely return. I don't know what that would involve, but I know we're scrambling to try to see what that might mean.
Yeah, and definitely something that they're going to be dealing with throughout the school year and possibly into next year.
Yeah.
One thing that we do know is that the pandemic has changed how people want to vote this year, with nearly 1 in 4 Kansas voters requesting an absentee ballot. Those ballots started going out this week as voting gets underway. KSN's Crystal Sherrill shows us what to expect.
This is what the Sedgwick County Election Office looked like on Wednesday, as thousands of mail-in ballots were prepared to be mailed out.
During the pandemic especially, folks don't want to get out as much as they had been in the past, so trying to make it as simple as possible.
That simple process now includes several ways to make sure your ballot gets turned in.
And they can return it via mail or the drop boxes or early voting site. Interest Bank Arena would be a great place to take it back to next week.
As early voting starts Monday, some community leaders are making sure all voters are able to get to the polls.
This is the most important election in our lifetime. So much is hanging in the balance right now.
That's why St. Mark United Methodist Church and several other churches have volunteered to transport voters to polling sites for early voting and Election Day.
We want to know so that we can get you to the polls, but that's just not for St. Mark members. That's for anybody in the city. We want folks to know that if you need a ride to the polls on Election Day, let us know. If you need to get to the polls for early voting, let us know.
Pastor Johnson says he will take people to vote himself if needed. He encourages people to help make a change in our community, our state, and our nation.
If you live in Wichita, you have no excuse. If you live in Salina, if you live in Hutch, if you let me know ahead of time, I'll find a way to get to you because I want you to go vote.
Talking about finding a way to get folks to the polls, we've got Texas, Georgia having record long lines as the polls open for early voting. Are we looking at something similar in Kansas?
I don't know if we'll see, lines on that level, but we're going to see lines. We're going to see a lot of people taking advantage of the opportunities that are being presented to them, like the pastor mentioned in that story, to get out to the polls. You're going to see more people taking advantage of early voting. And of course, there's a huge number of absentee ballots that are going to be filed. Are there going to be problems? There's absolutely going to be problems because people just don't have the manpower. They don't have the procedures in place to handle all of this, but they've been able to anticipate that it's coming, and hopefully they'll be ready for it.
Well, talking about the manpower and the procedures not being in place to handle things, they're dealing with similar issues at the Sedgwick County Courthouse as they try to get jury trials started back up after months of absence due to the pandemic. But as KSN's Hunter Funk shows us, not all trials are back on.
They had been really backlogged.
Josh Enlow recently sat on a trial in Sedgwick County. He says the process was slow with all of the pandemic precautions.
And it slowed down the process because everyone who mentioned any symptom, they had to say, are you still having the symptom?
From the questionnaires to wiping down the stand after every witness. With only 2 courtrooms, District Attorney Mark Bennett says it's been difficult to manage the time.
The problem has been we look at each other and go, I don't know when we can do this. I don't have a date to give you.
District Court Judge Kevin O'Connor says The challenge is adapting to the lower level cases.
Before, you had a tendency of the trials going all the way to a conclusion. For example, the 2 trials here today, they started with jury selection but ended up entering pleas.
Meaning judges are getting through the cases, but scheduling is a challenge as jury trials need more time.
Just trying to squeeze in 1 or 2 a week until we can make it 3 a week, until we make it 4 a week, until we can start doing 10 a week. Will that be 6 months from now? You know, if things keep clipping along the way they are, sure.
As for the backlog of cases, Bennett says the county will get through it.
I have no choice. I mean, I have to, yeah.
Hunter Funk, KSN News 3.
And we're talking months of backlog that they have to get caught up on, Suzanne. At what point do we reach the point where it's no longer just an inconvenience, but an injustice? I mean, some of the folks waiting for trial we know are not guilty.
Right. And District Attorney Mark Bennett has already petitioned to Governor Laura Kelly and state lawmakers to extend the state of emergency for precisely that reason, because we are now in danger of not having fair and timely trials for some of these suspects in these cases. It's just an incredible struggle. Again, like we talked about bars and restaurants, the effect on schools. This is just another institution that is finding itself having to muddle through this the best they can. But you're right; it absolutely raises questions about fair trials.
And talking about an executive order to extend that state of emergency, that's not an easy decision to make either in a situation like this.
No, it's not an easy decision to make, but I appreciate the governor being willing to step forward and at least, push forward the possibility. It's very, very easy for us to focus on businesses and focus on schools and just kind of leave aside the criminal justice system and, not pay attention to the struggles that people caught up in that process are facing in the case of COVID. It's important that we recognize that these are American citizens too, and they have rights as well. And we've got to find ways to serve those rights as citizens should.
All right. Well, Russell, Suzanne, thank you both so much once again for joining me this week. I'd also like to thank our news partners at KSN News, the Wichita Eagle, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. We'd love to continue it with you on social media. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or KPTS Channel 8 on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. For now, stay safe and have a great week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.